Hey everyone, welcome back to Behind the Veil. And in this episode, we are going to be going over the Mormon Trek West and all of the suffering and hardships that all these Mormon pioneers went through that the church probably does not want you to know. I mean, yes, they are pretty upfront, but yeah, it was a pretty rough trip. But there are also lots of stories that they don't want you to know, which is what we're going to go over today. So we're going to be discussing the heavy topics of children who were whipped and driven like cattle on the Mormon Trail, how Brigham Young used money and resources to bring whiskey, rum, brandy, coffee, tobacco, and his own steamboat engine and supplies for his store in the Salt Lake Valley, while handcart companies suffered loss of life and limb on the trail without adequate supplies or assistance. This episode is filled with information and stories that the LDS Church, like we said, doesn't want you to know about. So stay tuned for the rest of this episode because it's going to be a wild and heart-wrenching episode. And one thing, it's critical to understand the urgency that the early Mormon saints felt when they made the decision to embark on their trek west. When saints made the decision, it was not merely a casual one. It was considered a command of God, and to ignore it would be of great peril to their eternal salvation. They were taught by Joseph Smith that the second coming would be in their lifetime, and therefore the gathering of Israel, the gathering of the saints, was urgent. Here we have a quote from Joseph Smith himself about those who refused to gather. It says, quote, "I prophesy that man who tarries after he has an opportunity of going will be afflicted by the devil." Ooh. That obviously those saints did not want to be afflicted by the devil, so they did not tarry and they trekked westward eventually. Obviously, this was after Joseph Smith's death. And Brigham Young strongly preached the urgency of gathering Zion with threats to the salvation of those who did not heed his counsel. He claims that the church's main purpose was to roll on the work of the last day, gather the saints, preach the gospel, build up cities and temples, and send the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth and revolutionize the whole world. Wow, he very ambitious goals here.
Yeah.
So, escaping from, quote, Babylon or the larger society was also necessary for both temporal and spiritual salvation. Zion would not provide the only safety in what seemed as havoc and chaos that would precede the millennium. So they just wanted to escape Babylon so they would not have that havoc and chaos affect them. And it was this worldview that led the saints to follow the commands of Brigham Young at their own peril. After the repeal of the Nauvoo Charter in January of 1845 and the indictment of church leaders, including Brigham Young, for counterfeiting in December of 1845, which you can watch our previous video for more details on, the exodus from Nauvoo was hastened to the point that they were forced to leave without adequate preparation. This forced exodus was inevitable even before the indictments on counterfeiting charges, and according to Cultures in Conflict, and it was a documentary of the history of the Mormon War in Illinois, it says, when Joseph Smith extended his religious ideology to temporal affairs by holding all the important offices in Nauvoo, controlling the political life of his community, directing the voting behavior of his followers, and the planning to establish a political kingdom of God on earth with himself in charge, he placed Nauvoo on a collision course with the rest of America. Conflict of some kind was inevitable, and when he condemned his Mormon critics as enemies of the people and suppressed their civil rights through institutionalized violence, the non-Mormons, politically frustrated and fearful of despotism, resorted to mobocratic measures. And again, that was in Cultures in Conflict, a historical documentary.
Yeah. A lot of people don't realize how much control Joseph Smith had and his ambitions in trying to become the president of the United States. So, and bringing Mormonism to the United States in not in a diplomatic way.
Mhm.
So after Joseph Smith's death, this rhetoric continued, which eventually led to the rapid exodus in the middle of the frigid winter in Illinois. This group of saints who were wildly unprepared for what they would face on the unforgiving trek ahead. This dangerous trip would lead to the death of over 600 Mormon pioneers between February of 1846 and spring of 1847. Mormon pioneers were faced with frigid temperatures at night, axle deep mud, flooding streams, and lack of proper provisions to provide for their needs. The first death along the trail occurred quickly, barely 1 month after embarking on the trek westward. On March 18th, a man suffering from exposure to frigid temperatures became ill and died at Richardson's Point, Iowa. Those who left in the February companies were suffering, and by May 14th of 1846, I believe it was, they had been traveling for over 2.5 months and were starving, exhausted, and many had become ill. Another band of pioneers waited until spring, and it only took them a mere 3 weeks to catch up to the suffering pioneers who had been traveling through treacherous conditions for so long. As stated earlier, this dangerous trek led to the death of over 600 pioneers who died from exposure, malnutrition, scurvy, tuberculosis, pneumonia, malaria, and other diseases. And again, like we said, this exodus happened because the leaders of the Mormon church had been indicted on counterfeiting charges, and so they had to leave during the winter months rather than waiting until the spring. In a Deseret article, Brewster details the Mormon pioneer peril, and he says, quote, "It is difficult to determine with accuracy how many pioneers perished during the winter of 1846 and 1847, but clearly they were dying in epidemic proportions," Brewster said. Based on available records and estimates, it is estimated that a minimum of 600 died between June 1846 and May 1847 in winter quarters alone. Nearly half of those deaths were infants 2 years old and younger. All of this suffering and death so that the Mormon leaders of the church would not have to face mounting criminal charges against them. If you want to learn more, like we said before, about the reasons for the exodus of Nauvoo, you can watch our previous video on Brigham Young's indictment on counterfeiting and his escape from the United States. According to a BYU study, the Mormon pioneers did have a higher death rate than that of the average company of travelers west. However, they skewed the results by not including those who were forced to travel by handcart. Obviously, they were going to have a higher rate of death among the handcart travelers, and so they just did not include them. And that's why the numbers seem close to the other travelers, because they were only comparing wagon travelers to wagon travelers. But as we know, a lot of the Mormon pioneers were not traveling by wagon. A team of actuarial scientists at Brigham Young University analyzed 56,000 pioneer records from 1847 to 1868. Of these 56,000, there were an estimated 1,900 people who died either on the plains or within the calendar year of their arrival. So that's about a 3.5% mortality rate. If you compare this to other groups traveling west in around 1850, in those same years, the mortality rate was about 2.5%. So it was lower even among comparing wagon travelers to wagon travelers. So even with removing the handcart companies from the study, the Mormons still had a higher rate of mortality, even though it may not be significantly higher because of the way that they skewed the numbers.
And I'm sure we all know about the notorious fatal failure of the Martin and Willie Handcart companies. And these are well known among members of the church. Although the church does try to spin the death and devastation into some kind of sick and twisted tale of unwavering faith. But these were not the only saints who suffered immensely during their needless trek west. One of the most serious features of the Mormon Trail was a complete disregard for providing adequate provision of food. A prime example of the failure for leaders to provide proper preparation and consideration is the Edmund Ellsworth wagon, And it was full of soap. There was no food in that wagon.
That
And
soap is for Brigham Young's mercantile.
seriously, like, of course, Brigham
Yeah.
Young's gonna prioritize his own wants over providing food for the people coming across the country to Utah. And as detailed in Mary Powell Sabin's autobiography, it says, "At night, we often went to bed without supper. I remember Mary Powell Sabin, a 12-year-old, making the trek with her family. She was captivated by the beauty of the campsite at Deer Creek. It was so charmingly sylvan, with groves here and there, and a bright, clear creek lined with timber, that she proposed to her father, 'Let's build a little log house and stay in this place always.' He asked what they would do for food. She sadly proclaimed, 'Do as we're doing now and go without.'" She's flat out saying that they are going without food as they're heading west, and this girl would rather set up home where they're at because it sounds like it's a beautiful place rather than continue the trek onward. And again, they have no food. We got Lotwick Reese wrote, "There was very little food to cook, and we were too tired to cook it. We had very, very hard times, with scarcely enough food to sustain life and body. At Fort Bridger, Reese's mother traded everything the family owned for something to eat." The stories of starvation and suffering along the trail pile up as you pour through all these journals, reports, stories of the saints' trek westward. William Knox Atkin wrote that they arrived wearied and worn down, the bones almost through the skin, not only of myself, but of all that were in the company, having walked from Iowa City to the Great Salt Lake City, a distance of 1,350 miles, and were half starved to the bargain, our whole allowance being 12 ounces of flour per day, and we did not even get so much. If you think about it, 12 ounces of flour is not very much at all. And saying that they didn't even get 12 ounces per day, these people are starving while they're trying to trek westward. And we have toxic messages given to members of the Mormon Church in 1851 condemning anyone who wants to wait to travel in comfort. This was printed in the Deseret News on November 15th, 1851, and was entitled Sixth Generational Epistle of the Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It says, "O ye saints in the United States, will you listen to the voice of the Good Shepherd? Will you gather? Will you be obedient to the heavenly commandments? Many of you have been looking for and expecting too much. You have been expecting the time would come when you could journey across the mountains in your fine carriages, your good wagons, and have all the comforts of life and a heart could wish. But your expectations are in vain, and if you wait for those things, you will never come. You will leave your carcasses to rot in the midst of the Gentiles, and your faith and hope will depart from you. How long shall it be said in truth, the children of this world are wiser in their generation than the children of light? Some of the children of the world have crossed the mountains and plains from Missouri to California with a illegible, couldn't read that, on their back to worship their god, gold. Some have performed the same journey with a wheelbarrow. Some have accomplished it with a pack on a cow. Some of the saints now in our midst came hither with wagons or carts made of wood, without a particle of iron, hooping their wheels with hickory or rawhide or ropes, as a good and safe a journey as any in the camps, with their well-wrought iron wagons. Can you not do the same?" I'm sorry, hang on here. Saying if people want to wait to either for more favorable conditions or to actually have good equipment, literally saying you will leave your carcasses to rot in the midst of the Gentiles. Brigham Young loved to call everyone else who's not a part of the church the Gentiles. This is so manipulative. It is awful.
It's abusive. It's religious abuse, is what it is.
Absolutely.
Let's just call a spade a spade. This is religious abuse. And the thing is, it is also a bold-faced lie. Because those people that came in those wagons that did not have steel around the wheels, they wore down in the sand and in the rain and in the mud, and it warped the wheels, and it was extremely difficult to pull those carts. It is a bold-faced lie that they came as easily as anyone. It's absolutely unequivocally false. And yet here we have it printed. They don't care about these people, and we're going to go on and figure out, well, Brigham Young didn't care about anybody but himself, let's be real. So we're going to continue on with this abusive rhetoric coming from the first presidency of the Mormon Church. And it says, yes, if you have the same desire, the same faith, families may start from the Missouri River with cows, handcarts, or wheelbarrows with little flour and no unnecessary. Really? You want families with young children to come with just a little bit of flour and nothing else? And come to this place quicker and with less fatigue than by following the heavy trains with their cumbrous herds, which they are often obliged to drive miles to food. Do you not like this method of traveling? Do you think salvation costs too much? He's basically saying your salvation rests upon you traveling with not enough provisions. He says, if it is, 'tis not worth having. So he's basically saying, if your salvation, if you think this is too hard to do in order to obtain salvation, that's not worth you having it. Then he goes on to say, sisters 50 and 60 years old have driven ox teams to this valley and are alive and well yet. True, they could have come much easier walking alone than by driving a team, but by driving the oxen, they helped others here, and cannot you come the easier way? They are essentially condemning members of the church for simply seeking to prepare adequately. This is not people who are saying, I want to travel in the lap of luxury. These are people saying, I don't want to travel in the middle of the winter, and I don't want to pull a handcart that is not properly prepared for the conditions we are going to face. And yet they're being condemned for it. This is a treacherous and often fatal trek west. It is absolutely imperative that you are properly prepared for something like this. 1,300 miles of walking, you need to be adequately prepared. And yet here we have a scathing condemnation of responsible and legitimate concerns in this epistle, signed by the first presidency of the church, Brigham Young, Willard Richards, and Heber C. Kimball. This epistle represents willful disregard for the safety and well-being of members of their church. They are advocating that families embark on this long, treacherous journey with a cow, a little flour, and no unnecessaries. What are they deeming unnecessary? Adequate food? This advice is foolish at best and exposes reckless disregard for these families. It is common sense that a trek from merely Missouri to Salt Lake City, which equates to about 1,300 miles, should absolutely not be taken with such little preparation and provisions. Attempting such a thing is akin to playing Russian roulette with a gun. With rhetoric like this, these saints were forced to make a decision based on their own welfare and safety, or based upon religious threats to their salvation from their church leaders, claiming that their faith was not sufficient for salvation if they did not make the trek with reckless abandon. If this 1851 epistle wasn't bad enough, Brigham Young resurrects his heartless rhetoric once again in late September 1855, when he instructs Franklin D. Richards, who was a British mission president, to, quote, implement my old plan. We cannot afford to purchase wagons and teams as in times past, make handcarts, and let the emigration foot it, and draw upon them the necessary supplies, having a cow or two for every 10. He then gives his bogus reasons for doing so. They can come just as quick, if not quicker, and much cheaper, can start earlier, and escape the prevailing sickness which annually lays so many of our brethren in the dust. This is bullcrap. And the reason that this is that first thing when he says they don't have the money, they can't afford to purchase it. That's not true. As we will show you later, Brigham Young was using those wagons to bring his steamboat engine, supplies for his mercantile, whiskey, rum, tobacco, all things that were against the word of wisdom written by Joseph Smith. And yet he's prioritizing the wagons to get those things safely west rather than the people.
And Brigham Young had received information about what the needs of the handcart immigrants would be for the trek west. Prior to the tragic Willie and Martin Handcart Company trek, Brigham receives a letter in November of 1855. Apostle John Taylor details in this letter the carefully considered requirements of a handcart's emigration. He also states that he had appointed a committee in St. Louis who had walked the plains and therefore had the same experience to determine what supplies a cart with 4 persons would need to make the trek. And here were their suggestions. First off, 60 pounds of bread, also 60 pounds of meat, 1 pound of tea and sugar, 20 pounds in cooking utensils. They also needed clothing, bedding, and a tent. And all this would roughly come to about 449 pounds. They also recommended a cow for each 2 carts or 8 people, and a wagon with 3 yoke of oxen for every 10 carts. He further stipulated that above is predicted upon the calculation of being met with additional supplies at the upper crossing of the Devil's Gate.
Platte River. Yeah, Platte River.
Platte River, thank you so much. My script cut out there. Taylor cautioned Brigham Young. So literally saying that, okay, these are the bare minimum, and then they're going to be met with additional supplies almost halfway through. So, but as you remember earlier, they didn't have nearly these supplies when they're going across.
And we'll detail what they actually got in a little bit, compare the two, because it's not even remotely similar.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And John Taylor goes on to say, in regard to the feasibility of the enterprise, men, of course, differ in their opinions, and we must confess that on its first introduction, our prejudices were strong against it. We thought it looked too much like hard work for men to perform labor that has hitherto only been considered proper for beasts or draft and burden. Taylor's panel of experts had recommended allocating a wagon and 3 yoke of oxen for each 50 persons to carry provisions and convey the young and sick. And, of course, Brigham Young rejected this suggestion on July 28th. And here's what Brigham Young said. I will say that it is all right not to provide wagons for the infirm persons to accompany the handcarts, for it would encourage the infirmity, or rather laziness, which is quite as bad. There would soon be but few able to walk if such arrangements were made. We have hauled such character with worn out, broken down cattle long enough, and we had hailed this year's operations and as breaking through and throwing off an immense burden which has long oppressed us. So Brigham Young is further demanding deprivation of adequate accommodations for travelers who become ill or injured or who are very young. In the 13th epistle from the First Presidency, published in the Deseret News, we can see how Brigham Young begins to cut corners and then blames the saints who don't like all these cut corners.
Yeah, this is just ridiculous, saying that people are going to become lazy, so we're not going to provide any provisions for people who become ill or sick or for young children. It's absolutely despicable, but his reasons for doing it were completely selfish. He says, he continues on, let the saints, therefore, who intend to immigrate the ensuing year, understand that they are expected to walk and draw the luggage across the plains, and that they will be assisted by the fund in no other way. If any apostatize in consequence of this regulation, so much the better. For it is far better that they such deny the faith before they start than to do so for a more trifling cause after they get here. And if they have not faith enough to undertake this job and accomplish it too, they have not faith sufficient to endure with the saints in Zion, the celestial law, which leads to exaltation and eternal life. Essentially saying, if you're not willing to suck it up and drag your stuff here, you will get no assistance from us. And if you are not willing to do this, essentially you don't have faith for salvation. More abusive rhetoric from Brigham Young. The tragedy of this incessantly abusive rhetoric is that members absorbed this toxic ideology, and then they were condemning other fellow saints with the same harmful, toxic beliefs. And we still see this in Mormonism today. This constantly happens. We're not going to detail that today, but this is something that for well over 150 years, people are still using this abusive rhetoric of you don't have faith unto salvation. They still use this stuff today. But I'm going to give you a prime example from the Millennial Star in 1856 of how another member of the church was using Brigham Young's abusive language towards a young woman. This correspondence is a letter sent from Williamsburg, April 21st, 1856. The correspondence is between Patience Loader, who is a young woman, her father, James Loader, and John Jacques, who was a missionary in England who had immigrated to the United States. And I'm going to read this. I have a direct copy of this letter. So here we go. This original one is from Patience to Brother Jacques, and she says, "Dear Brother Jacques, on the 18th April, we received your letter dated March 29th. We had been anxiously awaiting to hear from you, and I can say that when we did hear, we felt somewhat surprised to find that we had to go by handcart. Father and mother think this cannot be done, and I am sure I think the same, for mother cannot walk day after day, and I do not think that any of us will ever be able to continue walking every day. We think it will be better to remain here or at St. Louis for a time until we are able to help ourselves to a wagon." This is all very legitimate concerns that this young woman has. "We are across the water, which is a great part of our way to Zion. Father and mother think you had better come here for a time. We will take lodgings for you if you will let us know. Do you and your wife think it right to go by the handcarts? If we girls were strong boys, then I think it might be done. But father is the only man in our family. I don't feel myself that I can go like this. If by staying here for a little time we can get means to go by a wagon, it will be far preferable. Mother, I am sure, can never go that way. She says herself that she cannot do it, and I don't think that any of us can. Why, we understood that the handcarts were the last resource. Mother says that she must have a revelation before she can see this right. Why, we shall have to sell nearly all of our clothing. And what shall we do for things to wear when we get to the valley? 17 pounds weight each is but very little. We shall be delighted to see you. I wish they in London would come with you. We are doing very comfortable now. I remain your sister in the gospel, and this Patience Loader." And then we get a letter back. And this letter back is to her father, Brother Loader, is what it, Dear Brother Loader is who it is addressed to. And this is from Jacques, and he says this: "On May 7th, I received with great pleasure a letter written by Patience and dated April 21st, because we had been so long expecting one, but my pleasure was changed to great pain and unfeigned sorrow when I read the contents. I have read the letter about half a dozen times. I could scarcely believe that you could have sent such a one. There is not one atom of the spirit of Zion in it, but the very spirit of apostasy." So he's essentially saying this young girl whose mother can't walk very well, they have a family of all girls. They're very concerned about walking that length of a trek under those conditions. And he's saying she is in a state of apostasy. "I felt to exclaim in my heart, who has bewitched you? And with whom have you been taking counsel that you should so soon forget the goodness of the Lord in delivering you from this part of Babylon and opening up your way to Zion? Jesus Christ wept over Jerusalem and said, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not." So in this letter, we read this desperation in this young girl's communication. She so desires to make the trek west, but has legitimate concerns about her mother's ill health and inability to walk day after day after day. 1,300 miles is really far. She's also concerned that they're a family of sisters. Again, a very legitimate concern for a young girl who's being asked to walk well over 1,000 miles, pulling hundreds of pounds without proper resources. The response of the man who received her letter, eerily reflects the toxic, abusive religious ideology constantly spouted by Brigham Young. He condemns this girl and claims that she's in a state of apostasy because of her fears. He says he has had great pain and unfeigned sorrow that he could scarcely believe she would send such a letter. There's not one atom of the spirit of Zion in her letter. He then condemns her, claiming she has a spirit of apostasy. Who has bewitched you? Who are you taking counsel from? And he's claiming that he's trying to save her from Babylon. I just want to say to you, this letter is the epitome of religious abuse.
And the letter doesn't just stop there. The letter actually continues on in a similar fashion, and we won't detail all of the abusive things that this man said to and about this young woman, because we have other topics we want to cover today. But I think it bears stating to really drive home the religious abuse that these people inflicted upon each other. We're going to read one more statement from this letter. It says, "Here I have been praying and exerting my faith and my influence with the Lord and with you to get you gathered to Zion. And now that he has been graciously pleased to open up your way, you turn around in his face and ungratefully tell him you cannot walk in it. But he must bring you a wagon to ride in. This is truly grievous to me. I am sure it is to God and his good spirit if I were to turn aside on my way to Zion for such trifling reasons as those in your letter. Now that the Lord has so kindly given to me the privilege of going, it seems to me that I ought to be damned, and I have no doubt but that I should be." As you stated earlier, this is religious abuse. And John used Brigham Young's promise from the 1855 13th epistle printed in the Deseret News to convince the Loder family that they would be safe and they would be blessed on their trek west, which turned out to be completely false. None of the families in these handcart companies were met partway with provisions, nor were they blessed. These companies were the greatest disaster the Mormon Trail has ever seen. Here is John's quote of the promises of Brigham Young. Quote, "The Lord has promised through his servant Brigham that the handcart companies shall be blessed with health and strength and be met part way with teams and provisions from the valley. And I am not afraid to prophesy that those who go by handcarts and continue faithful and obedient will be blessed more than they have ever dreamed of." Again, exactly, it's not true. Like, there's so much religious manipulation towards these handcart companies. And John Jacques arrogantly proclaims that patients deserve damnation for her reservations about traveling in a handcart. But his arrogance would meet its match when he fatefully joins the Martin Handcart Company, and during the trek west, his oldest daughter died among the frigid, unforgiving conditions they were forced to travel in. And after such harsh condemnation by John Jacques, the Loder family decided to make the trek west in the Handcart Company. Tragically, they also became part of the ill-fated Martin Handcart Company. Patient's father, James Loder, passed away on the trek, leaving Patience, her sisters, and her mother to suffer the remainder of the way pulling their handcarts. And you can read more about Patience Loder in her autobiography. It is in the BYU archives. And we will have a link to that on our blog post that will correspond with this video on our website. Despite the LDS Church's efforts to turn an unavoidable tragedy into a faith-promoting story, the details surrounding the fatal Willie and Martin Handcart Company's trek west do not support anything other than disregarding logical safety precautions by arrogant LDS leaders who put the lives of everyone under their watchful care in significant peril. In 1856, as the Willie and Martin Handcart Companies were making their trek west, they were faced with a fateful decision regarding the timing of the departure from Florence, Nebraska. Mormon Battalion veteran Levi Savage had decades worth of experience in Far West, which gave him ample experience to fully understand the peril that lay ahead. He strongly advised a late season departure from Nebraska. He warned of significant hazards that could be fatal due to winter conditions they would eventually face, leaving so late in the season. Despite the experienced counsel of Levi Savage, church leaders publicly mocked him and shamed him for speaking out against religious leaders. Franklin D. Richards encouraged the companies to proceed due to the idea put forth by Brigham Young that gathering to Zion was urgent and must be pursued without delay and without any regard for comfort or safety.
Yeah, that's the big one. Without any regard for comfort and safety. And that is exactly what he explicitly stated. This fateful decision would lead to the greatest immigrant disaster in the West. Make no mistake, Franklin D. Richards, who ordered the Willie and Martin Handcart companies to leave so late in the year, sealing the fate of many of these innocent immigrants, did not travel with them. I want to make that very clear. He is telling them that they have to pull these handcarts and they are leaving this late in the season. And he is the religious leader that makes the final decision for these people. And he did not travel with them. That the traveling in those conditions was not good enough for him. Franklin D. Richards followed in his comfortable and swift carriage, passing both companies and reaching the Great Salt Lake in early October, safe and sound before the worst of the weather hit. This is absolutely inexcusable. He was not willing to sacrifice his own welfare or life, but he was willing to put women and children's lives at risk with his decision. Franklin D. Richards has the innocent blood of these people on his hands. Absolutely. Similar to the first presidency epistle in 1851, chastising the saints for waiting together in Zion until they could travel in comfort and safety, like Franklin D. Richards did, Brigham Young again pulled this dangerous stunt again in 1855. As we detailed a little bit earlier, in this epistle, Brigham Young challenges the saints, let them come on foot with handcarts or wheelbarrows. Let them gird up their loins and walk through, and nothing shall hinder or stay them. Actually, that's not true. A lot of things hindered them. In true Mormon fashion, the saints blindly followed the irresponsible commands of their arrogant leaders. The immigrants who made a difficult journey from Europe, finally obtaining poorly built handcarts in Iowa City, and they make comments about how the wheels were not properly made. These were very poorly built handcarts to begin with. They were preparing to embark on their 1,300-mile trek west, pulling these sorry excuses for handcarts. In the beginning, they celebrated and sang as they walked. It was still warm. And yes, the primary song about the pioneers singing as they walked and walked and walked and walked is partly true. However, the singing did not last. This is the part they fail to tell the primary children or to members of the church at large. As these poor saints pulled their carts across the arid plains, the poorly built hand carts began to slowly fail. They were built with unseasoned wood that was not reinforced, and therefore it began to warp. If the warped wood wasn't difficult enough, the sand also began to grind down the unprotected wooden wheels and axles on the carts. The warped and worn wood made the carts extremely difficult to pull and made an already strenuous 1,300-mile trek painfully demanding. The Willie and Martin Handcart companies did not pull out of Florence, Nebraska until September 2nd. These companies had experienced the scorching heat, and most likely frigid temperatures were the furthest things from their minds at this point as they were pulling out to finish their trek west. Let's take into consideration the difficulty involved with pulling a cart in the most optimal conditions. A handcart weighed about 60 pounds. Each handcart was designed to accommodate, they were having 5 people per handcart instead of, what did we say last time? 4. So they have an extra person with 17 pounds of personal belongings, which would be about 85 pounds. Each cart carried a 98-pound sack of flour for food. Each cart fully loaded weighed approximately 243 pounds. What did we say the carts would weigh if they were adequately supplied? 449 pounds. So let's go over the earlier provisions. They only had 17 pounds of individual belongings, your clothing, your blankets, shoes, or socks, or whatever it was that you needed, and a 98-pound sack of flour. Let's look at what was the recommendations that were made to Brigham Young. 68 pounds of bread, 60 pounds of bread, 60 pounds of meat, a pound of tea and sugar, 20 pounds of cooking utensils, the clothing, bedding, and a tent, which was 449 pounds. So if you compare that, one sack of flour was all they were given to eat. And they are condemning these people, saying you will lose your salvation if you do not travel like this. This is absolutely criminal and nothing less.
Absolutely. And these numbers don't even take into consideration small children who had to ride in the carts, or individuals who became too ill to walk as the trek went on. With the addition of a small child or an ill adult, these immigrants would at times be pulling or pushing upwards of 300 to 500 pounds with any additional weight from children or ill adults. And with missionaries prioritizing women for their polygamous ideals, many of these carts were moved by women and girls. If you want more information about missionaries in foreign countries enticing women and girls into the church, only to have them lined up and chosen for polygamous wives, we will be doing a full episode on that very, very soon. So make sure you stay tuned, subscribe, so you can see when that video comes out. But continuing on, tragedy began to befall the ill-fated companies in Wood River on September 4th. And this was about 170 miles out from Florence. And a buffalo stampede carried away most of the oxen, which could not be recovered. They were forced to harness up their much weaker and totally untrained milk cows and beef cattle, which could not haul as much. This was just the beginning of their suffering that could have been easily avoidable if their leaders had put aside their pride and simply waited the winter out before making the trek. Instead, they are plunged into dark, freezing winters and fully exposed to the elements, and pulling these rickety, run-down handcarts with barely any food to eat. So by October 1st, the Willie Company reached Fort Laramie on a typical, well-planned trek. Laramie provided a source of supplies for travelers. However, because of the ill-thought-out decision by church leaders, this late in the season, Fort Laramie was completely out of flour, of basically all of their supplies. Really, they could only offer these poor souls a couple of Cracker Barrels, and that's it. These immigrants became painfully aware of their grim fate. They still had 700 miles to go without enough supplies or food. Captain Willie simply cut their daily rations of flour and they moved on. And as the days dragged on, pulling these wobbly, rickety handcarts, it became painful and life-sapping work. They were slowly being starved as they pulled and pushed what little they had. At one point, completely and utterly exhausted, they began to throw most of their belongings on the side of the trail, desperate to lighten their impossible burden. As temperatures began to plunge, creating a very real risk of hypothermia and illness, these saints even left behind bedding and their warm clothing that would have provided at least some shield from the painful frigid air. As they continued shivering in the night without warm bedding or clothing, feeling as though they can barely survive, they still trekked onward, starving, shivering, and weak. In their poor physical condition, they arrive at Sweetwater River. These saints, again, without proper food, clothing, bedding, supplies, anything, are forced to cross this frozen, icy river. As they began stepping into the river, feeling the dangerous icy water engulf them, their weakened bodies struggled to maintain warmth. Many of them began to question what their leader had told them about this handcart scheme. Brigham Young insisted this was God's plan. But as these starving, hypothermic saints crossed this frigid, icy river, they began to question, is this truly God's plan for us? And we have some writing from John Chislett about the tragic situation of these saints who had been swindled and misled by church leaders.
Yeah. John says the chill which the icy water sent through our systems drove out of our minds all holy and devout aspirations and left a void, a sadness. The children's primary song of pioneer singing as they walked and walked and walked is a deceitful and disrespectful ode to these suffering saints who lost limbs and loved ones on a trek that had absolutely no purpose and could have been attempted at any other time, even years later, without any effect upon their salvation. And I do want to stop here really quickly and just let you know, we actually do have relatives that were in the Martin and Willie Handcart companies, and I believe 8 of them passed away. 8 of our own relatives passed away in this handcart company. So we have journals, books, and stories of our own of the suffering that these people went through, and it's absolutely despicable. There were some who were even told to burn their clothing for heat by their leaders. So this entire thing was just absolutely tragic. Levi Savage was entirely correct in his predictions, and the church leaders ended up having the blood of these innocent people on their hands. After crossing the icy Sweetwater River, the freezing weather in combination with starvation, exhaustion, dysentery, and death began to take its course, slowly taking the life of one suffering soul after another. John Chislett continues to detail the heartbreaking condition of these innocent people whose fate had been sealed by prideful men. And John says, life went out as smoothly as a lamp ceases to burn when the oil is gone. At first, the deaths occurred slowly and irregularly, but in a few days at more frequent intervals until we soon thought it unusual to leave our campground without burying one or more persons. They're basically saying every night when they camp, they're burying people in the morning. He says he watched helplessly as many a father pulled his cart with his little children on it until the day preceding his death. John was in charge of a smaller group within the company that comprised 100 of the saints. By the end, he writes, I could not raise enough men to pitch a tent when we camped. Sarah James, who was an 18-year-old girl traveling with the Martin and Willie Handcart companies, wrote that she was, quote, cold all the time. There was either rain or snow or wind. Even when you wrapped up in a blanket, your teeth chattered. These people were slowly and torturously starving and freezing to death. If only this was the end of the suffering, and yet it was not. They reached the last of the rations of flour while it was still October. John Chislett continues to detail the tragedy as he writes, we traveled on in misery and sorrow. At this point, the Martin Handcart Company was in far worse condition as they were nearly 100 miles behind the Willie Company. The Martin Company find themselves on the edge of the icy Platte River with no choice but to cross. They were forced to wade into chest-deep, frozen, icy water. They pushed aside chunks of ice as they waded across to the other side. Their starving, exhausted bodies began to suffer total fatigue and severe frostbite. We have stories of many people having to amputate limbs of people on the way. As this tragedy continues to unfold, the saints suffer in unforgiving weather, slowly freezing and starving to death. What at the beginning may have been mistakenly believed to be God's plan has revealed the true nature of this ill-timed and ill-fated trek as Satan's nightmare, inflicted upon innocent people who were threatened with their salvation if they did not make this trek with haste.
And if you think back to earlier in this podcast, when we talked about Patience Loader, she was a young woman who was chastised by missionary John Jackas for her fear about making the trek. And she was among the Martin Handcart Company. and writes about the misery and suffering and grief in her company. It says Brigham Young is writing on here. I apologize for the typo. When we was in the middle of the river, I saw a poor brother carrying his child on his back, and he fell down in the water. I never knew if he was drowned or not. I felt sorry that we could not help him, but we had all we could do to save ourselves from drowning. After we got out of the water, we had to travel in our wet clothes until we got to camp, and our clothing was frozen to us. This gruesome and tragic details of the suffering and death among these travelers becomes unbearable when you realize that this trek was all for naught. There was no necessity for these poor souls to make this trek at all, as the second coming never came. Because if you remember earlier in this episode, towards the beginning, Brigham Young and the leaders of the church would be like, the second coming is coming soon. We must gather Israel. We're like 150 or more years in the future, and the second coming, we're apparently still waiting on that. And the doctrine has now changed, and saints are encouraged to remain in their own stakes wherever they live. So realistically, there was no need for all this suffering, no reason for them to gather. And I want to emphasize strongly that the death toll from the Willie and Martin Handcart companies has never been firmly established. So we cannot say for sure how many people died from these companies. But historians have estimated that the Willie Company lost somewhere between 62 and 77 members, while the Martin Handcart Company lost somewhere around 150 members.
I find this highly unbelievable considering that our own relatives lost like 8, like one family.
Yeah,
and they're saying that they're getting, like, they're burying people literally almost every single morning, one or more people. It's like, I think somebody's trying to hide some numbers here. Just saying.
These numbers are definitely not lining up, but these are the numbers that historians provided, so we'll let you guys decide whatever you want to believe. Yep. And then we got the Willie Handcart Company. They arrived in Salt Lake City on November 9th. And the Martin Handcart Company arrived a few weeks later on November 30th. So the majority of the Martin Handcart Company, they did arrive on November 30th. And then a few trailing wagons rolled into the city in early December. And what the faithful stories and death statistics don't tell you are the large numbers of immigrants from these companies who were permanently maimed for life. Many of these poor souls had to be taken care of until they recovered from starvation, or they had rudimentary amputation. They dealt with frostbite, hypothermia, or other serious conditions. Because just think of traveling across the country in the dead of winter. There's obviously permanent afflictions that these people had. And the Willie and Martin Handcart companies were promised that supplies would be provided from Salt Lake City. Unfortunately, these were empty promises. So let's see what happened to these relief trains that figured so prominently in the planning system. Those that even John Jacobs was promising Patience Loader and her family based on Brigham Young's words, because as we saw earlier, Brigham said, we will be sending supplies, we will be sending help. But no, that didn't really happen.
That did not happen. So he, instead of following recommendations, they get a sack of flour, and that's it, which is unconscionable in itself. But then he was promising that he was going to send supplies. But by the end of September, Brigham Young had not sent a single wagon load of supplies to re-provision the Willie and Martin Handcart companies as he had promised to do. Here's the kicker. He did send, however, a relief wagon with flour that reached A.O. Smoot's church train at the upper crossing of the Platte River on October 2nd. What did he do that for? Well, it's because of what Smoot's wagon train was carrying. The promised supply stations had not been established for the first migration in 1856. And the relief wagons that were meant to meet the immigrants in Wyoming often did not arrive until long after they were desperately needed. The very same year, the immigrants were forced to walk, pulling handcarts due to, quote, lack of funds, right? To provide them adequate provisions of food and wagons, Brigham Young is importing a large quantity of items for profit, including many items that are against the religion's word of wisdom, which I find very interesting. According to the book, The Lion of the Lord, a biography of Brigham Young, in 1856, one member of the church freighted, meaning they were carrying across the plains, 6 tons of tobacco, rum, whiskey, brandy, tea, and coffee. It's literally like take the word of wisdom and everything that it says that they are not supposed to have. And this is what Brigham Young is importing to Salt Lake. All of these items, as I said, they are prohibited in LDS canonized scripture in Doctrine and Covenants, section 89. But not only did Brigham Young ship these materials to Salt Lake in wagons, not handcarts like the Willie Martin Handcart Company. No, these were in wagons. He admitted to owning a distillery. Brigham Young stated in the Journal of Discourses, when there was no whiskey to be had here and we needed it for rational purposes, I built a house to make it in. What rational purposes do we need whiskey for? So while he claims that they didn't have the funds to safely provide passage for the saints to travel across the plains, they certainly had the funds to bring tobacco, alcohol, coffee, and tea in wagons. Before anyone tries to claim they needed those items for revenue, to bring in revenue in the financially struggling Utah economy, there was so much more to it than that. Yes, it was financial in nature. Brigham Young was trying to make money off of the coffee and the tea and the alcohol and all of that, but not to help the poor, not to help the lowly members of the church. It was a business decision by Brigham Young and other leaders of the church. In the book, Lights and Shadows of Mormonism, it discusses the fact that high priests were selling whiskey at $2.50 a gallon, and the city evaded whiskey taxes. O.H. Hollister, who was a government revenue collector, sued Salt Lake City for $30,000. Do you realize how much money that was in the mid-1800s? To collect on the distillation of moonshine by LDS high priests. And if you are, a member, you may not know what moonshine is, but look it up. It's alcohol. But Hollister ended up settling for $12,051.76 because they were not paying taxes on the whiskey they were selling. And this is LDS high priests and leaders of the church that are making this whiskey and selling it. If claiming a lack of finances to help suffering traveling saints while you are importing items in direct violation of the, quote, laws of God proclaimed in canonized scripture isn't enough to show how little regard Brigham Young had for these immigrants, let's continue with the details of his demands of bringing a steamboat engine across the plains. And this steamboat was for himself, by the way.
Yes. So the year prior to the Willie and Martin Handcart Company's trek west, Brigham Young became insistent about his desire for a steamboat engine. He's claiming that the church is tightening the belts on finances due to a devastating winter that destroyed crops and caused financial hardship. And as he's claiming financial hardship to the members of the church, he is secretly seeking to import an extremely expensive machinery for his own benefit. So he ordered Erastus Snow in St. Louis to find a steamboat engine, apparently to use in the Great Salt Lake. And Erastus attempted to comply with Brigham's demands, but sent word back to Brigham in February of 1855 that he had taken Brigham Young's specifications for his steamboat engine to several experienced engineers, and every single one of them discouraged this experiment. In the words of Erastus Snow, all speak very discouraging of your contemplated experiments. The experts estimated the specified engine would weigh in at approximately 13,000 pounds. And According to a quote from Erastus's letter sent to Brigham Young, all agreed that if we get up the article you call for, it would not give satisfaction neither in making salt or propelling your boat. So during this year, Brigham writes in the 13th epistle claiming financial hardship and condemning saints who do not want to make the trek westward with handcarts, all while seeking to spend exorbitant amounts of money and manpower to source a steam engine. But not to worry, arrogant Brigham Young does not take no for an answer, as we've clearly seen in several of our other episodes. So he ordered the Apostle Erastus Snow to purchase an engine and ship it overland. This means that there will be a massive endeavor with a lot of manpower and men and money expended to bring this massive 13,000 pound steam engine across the plains and mountain passes. So, of course, Erastus obediently followed orders, disassembled the parts, and loaded 5 wagons with the disassembled steamboat parts and sent them west in the summer of 1855. And these wagons were sent with the church train that was under the leadership of Isaac Allred. And this team was underpowered and undermanned for this massive undertaking. Because not only are they going to have to be carrying supplies for themselves for food, bedding, clothing, and all that, they're also trying to bring across a 13,000 pound steam engine. And Brigham was undeterred by his exploitation of those who were trying to obediently make the trek westward to Zion. He exploited these people to bring his beloved steamboat engine to him. The unfortunate souls forced to undertake this task without proper manpower traveled at snail's pace and gave up at about 30 miles beyond the Missouri River. And frankly, I can't blame them. They're trying to haul this massive steam engine just so Brigham can have his boat. And they were within 10 miles of the horrific scene where wolves had dug up the graves of more than 30 Mormon immigrants who had died of cholera in June of 1835 at Deer Creek, Kansas. And this is just another tragic story of Brigham Young's urgent calls for saints to gather in Zion without any legitimate reason for this urgency. Other than Brigham Young wanted his steamboats, he wanted his whiskey, rum, coffee, tea, all that crap.
Yeah, a lot of people think that these leaders didn't drink alcohol or they didn't do. There's a lot of journal evidence and other things that they absolutely did.
Absolutely.
So, and as we were saying, he is allocating wagons to bring. This is many parts of a 13,000 pound steam engine. I believe they said it was 8 wagons just for that. That's not including other supplies and other things he was having brought over. Well, these wagons are being allocated to bringing his stuff over rather than protecting saints that are trying to travel. As Allred's team slowly and painfully dragged these 5 wagons, they left them in a farmer's yard and asked him to watch over them until next spring. So this is why we're seeing in 1855, the year before the Martin Willie Handcart companies, they started trying to bring this over and they just couldn't make it. And so they left all of these wagons. So I guess it says here they left 5 wagons. Allred's company clerk wrote in August, despite the famine winter of 1855-1856, Brigham Young did not give up on his steamboat engine. So now we're in April of 1856. So we're going to start running into him trying to get this steamboat engine to Salt Lake at the same time the Martin Willie Handcart companies are coming. So in April of 1856, he dispatches Abraham O. Smoot and Ira Eldridge to rescue his equipment that had been left on this farmer's property. Before Erastus Snow was scheduled to return back to St. Louis in April, Brigham Young detailed his expectations. And he says this in a letter to Erastus Snow: "You will attend to this business very carefully and strictly, particularly with regard to the steam engine, as I wish it brought on this season perfect in every particle. And should you find the least essential portion lacking, it will be necessary for you to see that any such deficiency is made up. Wait a minute. He's threatening Erastus that if anything goes wrong with his steam engine and it does not arrive in perfect order, Erastus will be on the hook for the cost to fix it. Brigham Young was far more concerned with the welfare and of his beloved steam engine and its safe arrival to the Salt Lake Valley than he was for the saints, who were forced to travel 1,300 miles walking, pulling sorry excuses for handcarts with inadequate provisions. You can see how Brigham Young is providing wagons and everything needed, trying to get this steam engine, threatening those that are bringing it. If it doesn't come in perfect order, you're on the hook for it. Screw the handcart companies that are walking because I want my steam engine. So, around the same time, during the so-called financial hardships that forced Brigham to cease providing financial help to traveling saints who were commanded with the threat of their salvation to gather in Zion, Brigham is also making arrangements to import machinery for a woolen mill. So we're not just the steamboat, we're not just the rum and whiskey and brandy and coffee and tea and all this other stuff. He's now trying to import a woolen mill. And now we have a letter from James H. Hart, who was the presiding elder in St. Louis while Erastus Snow was traveling out of that St. Louis area. He states that the mill weighed an estimated 45 tons and would require about 20 extra strong wagons to transport it to Utah. Wait a minute. We've got wagons transporting steamboat engines, 20 extra strong wagons transporting this woolen mill, and other wagons transporting coffee, tea, alcohol, and all of this. And yet the saints are dragging along handcarts. The saints are being condemned for wanting to travel west in a wagon and being told that there was simply not the financial resources to provide them with wagons for the trek. And if they had adequate faith, they would make the trek without waiting for a wagon. And yet Brigham Young is supplying 20 wagons with teams of oxen and men with them to bring a woolen mill to Utah for his business. Brigham Young prioritized his business endeavors using crucial resources, including financial resources and manpower that could have been used to provide safe travel for the saints. He diverted them for his own business interests while condemning any saint who dared complain about the meager provisions they were given.
It's honestly so sad how selfish Brigham Young really is. It's just awful.
Oh, yeah.
And then, so on October 28th, the last two handcart companies, Smoot, on October 28th, as the last two handcart companies suffered, Smoot reported to Brigham Young from Fort Bridger the 22 heavy-laden church wagons in his freight train had suffered a long and tedious snowstorm that battered the party for the last 7 or 8 days. He reported that they made it to the fort, but the teams had given out, that they would be unable to continue on. He tells Brigham Young that he would store the thrashing machine, steamboat engine, fixtures, and groceries at the post for winter. So here is a quote from Smoot's letter. I had met at or near the South Pass 40 yokes of good fresh cattle, as I anticipated we should have been able to have brought all the freight in. But why they have not met me, you know better than I. So Smoot here is literally saying that he's like waiting for this, but they have not yet met him. And here we see that even the team bringing Brigham's goods and machinery were caught in brutal storms and left without the proper supply wagons. Smoot's original decision to leave the heavy machinery and supplies for Brigham Young's store was a prudent decision. However, Brigham Young was obviously impatient and wanted his freight. Franklin Benjamin Woolley, one of Smoot's teamsters, recalled that the train continued onto Echo Canyon. Here, quote, Brother Smoot, received a letter from Brother Young directing him to bring all the goods in, and if he had not enough teams to call upon the brethren who were out in the mountains with teams and with ox teams to assist. The handcart companies or to assist the handcart companies to assist in bringing in the wagons.
That's
So
where you get, there's your proof right there. He's telling them, if you don't have enough, you pull the people off that were trying to help the handcart companies and you make them get my wagons in first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in response to Brigham's command, Smoot assigned 22-year-old Woolley and a single companion to do the job. On November 4th, these two men met the survivors of James G. Willie Company on Bear River. Willie was unable to walk at this point, and rescue leader William H. Kimball had departed that morning for Salt Lake to, quote, report on the condition of things in the mountain. He had left the party in charge of Mormon Battalion veteran William Hyde and a man named Gold. The Willie Company, quote, had not teams enough to haul the feeble that were left behind. Now the company learns that, quote, President Brigham Young had sent word that some freight was still lying at Fort Bridger and was to be brought in this season, and that some teams and men of our company were needed to go on to Bridger. And of course, here again, we got Brigham Young be like, hey, yo, you forgot some of my freight out here. You need to go get it.
Yeah, so basically what you're seeing here is that instead of providing, people will say, oh, as soon as Brigham Young found out that the Willie Martin handcart companies were struggling out in the snow, he sent teams out to get them. No, he was sending teams to get his freight, to get his steamboat engine, to get his woolen mill, to get all of his supplies for his mercantile. He was pulling men off of helping the handcart companies to make sure that that freight came in. So no, he was not just sending them help, and he was actually prioritizing his things and sending a couple of men to help with those companies. It was absolutely ridiculous. And the way that they tried to say, oh, as soon as they knew they were helping us, BS. He created this horrible situation in the first place by prioritizing wagons for his own supplies. And the whole thing was a disaster. And Brigham Young is entirely at fault for how this went down. So we have William Woodward wrote in the camp journal, quote, several teams and men were selected for the trip. Woolley recalled he had to do, quote, considerable talking to some of the brethren who feared the season was too late to venture back to the fort with cattle. So he's talking about sending men back to get all of the freight, not the handcart companies. So at this time, Willie's party was still 80 miles from Salt Lake, which if you think, if you're driving a car, that's not a big deal. But if you're walking, that's a long ways. The Martin Company was still trapped at Martin's Cove, where the next day their ration of flour was reduced to 4 ounces for adults and 2 ounces for children, which is not enough food for anything. As you read this account, it becomes clear that Brigham Young pulled men off the rescue of the handcart companies to ensure that his own steamboat engine and supplies would arrive that year. So let's move on from that to the true stories of the Trek West, not the whitewashed stories the church tries to put forth, or the church will say, oh, someone died and they dug a grave with a spoon. Look at their faith. They try to make it like faith promoting stories, which in my opinion is disgusting. Yeah. A single woman by the name of Elizabeth Lane Hyde went lame in the Black Hills on the Trek West. Despite her disability, Edward Bunker refused to let her put a small bundle in the wagon. She claims that not only she can't even walk, and he's not even going to let her put a small bundle of her things in a wagon, let alone ride in it. She claims that John Cousins, a fellow traveler, carried me on his back through many rivers, and when Captain Bunker put me out of the wagon at Laramie River, he picked me up and carried me through the water. The brutal way that this young woman was treated by men on the trek is inexcusable, and it is not an isolated event. The brutality of members of the church are a direct reflection of their top leadership, namely Brigham Young. Abuse among the Mormon travelers is not isolated or a rare occurrence. We move on to Icelandic veteran of Daniel MacArthur's company, who details the treatment of children in his company. The train's 30 children were gathered together every morning and they were sent ahead of the company in a bunch, apparently to keep them from holding up the progress of the company. He says, quote, they were driven along with willows and had to keep walking as long as they could. No use to cry or complain, but along during the day when it was hot, they were allowed to rest and were given food. They were often 2 or 3 miles ahead of us. So again, with willows, they are whipping these children along and to keep them from holding them back. Theodore Dendrickson recalls it was hard for parents to see their little 5 and 6 year olds driven along like sheep. This is blatant abuse of these children, and it is heartbreaking, but it is just one more story in the sad reality of how Mormon people truly behave towards one another. When people say the children sang as they walked, no, they did not. And this is two different witnesses saying that these children were abused on these trails and whipped. If you believe this was an isolated event of 30 children from a single company, you would be mistaken. This practice of abusing children was also reported by Handcart immigrant C.C.A. Christensen in 1857. So we have a third report of this. He writes about remembering early in the morning the children who could walk. Some, even under the age of 4, were sent ahead, accompanied by their sisters, partly to avoid the dust and partly to walk as far as possible before the burning sun and exhaustion would make it necessary to put them in the carts.
These children were driven to walk in blistering heat or frigid temperatures, suffering all manners of exposure, illness, danger, and disease on the trek west, and it never needed to be so brutal. Then we move on to the exploitation and deception by church missionaries. So here we have an account of Elizabeth Cam, who felt exploited and deceived by church missionaries. She writes and criticizes the financial and logistical mishandling of the immigration process. And as we've detailed, Brigham Young diverted many resources to his business endeavors for alcohol, tobacco, coffee, steamboats, wool mills, all of that. And Elizabeth watched her husband die along the trail and was forced to amputate her own children's feet while making the trek west with the Martin Handcart Company. She claims that missionaries tried to cheat her unbaptized husband as he tried to purchase railroad tickets. Her husband then comes to her and says, "Oh, Eliza, you have got among a bad lot. All they want is my money. God's servants look after the souls of the saints, not their purses. Haven't you done wrong in leaving our home?" And at Iowa City, she watched as her treasured possessions and clothing were sold at auction for pittance. And not only were her possessions sold off for this trek that would cost her dearly, but even worse, she noticed that it was all bought mostly by elders from the valley, and they knew the value of it in Utah. So did I when I got there with nothing to wear. This woman and her family were exploited mercilessly, but missionaries and church leaders and left them to die along the trail unless by some providence of God they happened to survive. The immigration agents failed to provide the wagons that they had promised to transport the baggage, personal property, children, and the sick. But instead, these wagons were all loaded with merchandise. And they told us that they were for President Young's store in Salt Lake. So here we have a direct statement of a woman who was told that she would not be provided with a wagon because Brigham was using them to transport goods for his own profit and benefit. Brigham cared more about the ship and alcohol in the mill and all of his goods than he did for the handcart companies. In Will Bagley's paper, he points out that Brigham sent out a group of rescuers and a second group tasked with getting his whiskey supply steam engine all the way to Salt Lake City from a barn that it had been stored in when winter hit. And it was somewhere out past Laramie. A day or two later, Young sent a note telling the group going to get his stuff to pull people and resources off the rescue if needed. And their work was more important. And about 20 men were pulled, and teams and food as well. That steam engine And it was a very expensive order bought with money that could have been used to get supplies, wagons, provisions, and all this stuff for these saints traveling across. And instead, it was used for steamboats on the Great Salt Lake that actually never ended up being built. It sat unused for a couple years, and then it was eventually an alternate use of that steam engine was eventually found. And we can see here that Brigham Young is so selfish. He wants a steam engine. He wants his whiskey. He wants all this stuff. And he's like, oh, these other groups, they don't really have my stuff. Screw them. These rescuers are going to get my stuff. And
Yeah, it was a tragedy. And this is the thing, is that the church does not detail out to members what was really happening, the reason why all of these people died. It was unnecessary for them to be traveling in the first place. But then telling them, oh, we don't have enough money, we're going to give you hand carts, because Brigham Young, if you count the 20 wagon, like all of the wagons that were being used, is an absolutely insane number of wagons that were being used to transport his goods, while these saints were being given improperly built hand carts. It was disgusting.
absolutely. So, and I
They
appreciate
were
anyone
lied
who's.
to.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh yeah.
they
So
were lied
sorry.
to.
Absolutely lied to. And if you stuck around to the end, thank you so much for watching to the very end. And make sure you stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where we detail so many more tragic stories of people being manipulated to come to Utah and all the suffering that even happened when they were here in Utah. So, and make sure you check out our Instagram and our websites. We've been posting a lot more on our Instagram lately, and we've got lots of fantastic products on our website. So make sure you go check out both of those. But again, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.